In my last guide, I walked you through how the staging ground works and how to set up the basic gear presets. In this video, we're taking that a step further. This is an advanced breakdown focused on using villagers' traits and skills to make better combat decisions. If you haven't used the staging ground yet, I highly recommend starting with my first guide, but if you're already comfortable with it, let's get into the advanced setups. When you first unlock the staging ground, the basic one-handed and two-handed presets I recommend work just fine. They get weapon and armor on your villagers, and honestly, that's all you need right away. But as you progress, you may start to notice that even though your villagers are geared, you're not getting the most out of every fighter. Enemies get tougher, gear becomes more specialized, and you'll see some villagers consistently perform better than others, even when they're wearing similar equipment. At that point, it's no longer just about having gear, it's about matching the gear to the right villager. In the earlier guide, I had you craft a simple one-handed and two-handed preset. In this guide, we're building on that by introducing trait-focused gear sets that help your villagers lean into what they're already good at. Specifically, we'll be looking at a one-handed fierce, two-handed fierce, and a ranged fierce. We'll also check out a one-handed swordsman and a two-handed swordsman. This isn't about complicating the system, it's about specialization, making small adjustments that let your army scale naturally as the game gets harder. By now, you already understand how to recruit villagers and check their stats and traits. What we're going to focus on now is how to actually use that information for combat. Traits and skills don't necessarily serve the same purpose. Traits give your villager a direction, what they're naturally going to be suited for. Skills and skill caps define their long-term potential. This is why two villagers can look very similar early on, but end up performing very differently in the later stages of the game. When you're evaluating a villager, don't just look at their current skill levels. What really matters is how high those skills can eventually go. A villager who starts weaker but has a higher skill cap will often outperform someone who begins stronger but hits that ceiling early. A good example of this is strength. Some late game weapons and armor require higher strength to equip. If a villager can only reach level 6 strength, they'll never be able to use the gear, no matter how effective they were early on. Because traits and skills are locked when you recruit a villager, optimization really starts before you ever assign a preset. You don't need perfect villagers, but knowing what you're hiring someone for makes a huge difference. It's also important to remember that villagers can have multiple traits. One bad trait doesn't automatically disqualify someone from combat. What matters is how those traits work together and whether they fit the role you're planning to give them. As you progress through tiers, it's completely normal to reassess your army. Some villagers that worked well early on may be better kept in your settlement later, while newer recruits take over the combat roles. Before we get into actual presets, we need to talk about weapons. Not damage formulas or spreadsheets, just how different weapon types function in combat. When I talk about weapon roles, I'm not saying one weapon type is better than another. What matters is how that weapon fits based off the skills and traits your villager has. Weapon damage in Bellwright falls into 3 categories: cutting, blunt, and piercing. And some weapons deal more than one type of damage. Axes will deal cutting damage. Swords deal cutting and piercing. Maces and warhammers will deal blunt style damage. Bows and crossbows deal piercing damage. You don't need to memorize this, just understand that different traits interact with these damage types in a different way. This is where traits start to matter, because they reward or penalize certain choices. There's going to be a few traits that we're not going to be covering in this video. Although some of them are relevant to combat, I don't see the reason to include this in the video since we're mostly talking about the gear presets. I can cover those in a later guide if you guys would like. I do want to talk briefly about weak link because this has to do with what happens in combat when your villager falls. If your villager gets injured in combat, there is a 5% chance that they are going to drop the items that they are carrying. So do keep that in mind when you are bringing them out raiding with you. The Swordsman trait boosts cutting damage and attack speed, which makes cutting-focused weapons like axes a natural fit. Swords still work, but because they mix cutting and piercing, they don't fully capitalize on the bonus every single time. Defender traits reduce arrow piercing damage dealt, which means they should never be archers. For melee combat though, they're flexible. What really matters here is their skill caps, not a specific damage type. The Fierce trait villagers hit hard, but they take more damage, so survivability, armor choice, and weapon speed matter more. You will assign these weapons based solely off their stats. If they have a higher archery stat, they will do well, or if they have a higher one-handed or two-handed, they should start using those weapons. Because they receive a higher percentage of damage, they are best suited for heavy armor. Marksmen are the one group where damage type actually matters a lot. Their bonuses favor piercing damage, and their penalties hurt cutting and blunt. Their bow is always going to be their primary weapon, but their backup should at least be fast and piercing capable, purely for emergencies. They are best equipped with daggers and one-handed polearms for their backup weapon. Weapon choice isn't about chasing perfect damage numbers, it's about avoiding bad pairings and letting traits do what they're naturally good at. Now that we've covered how weapon rolls actually work, let's break down one of the presets I use, the One-Handed Swordsman. When I say sharp weapons, I'm talking about weapons that deal cutting damage, things like swords and axes. So I'll show you guys how I set up my One-Handed Swordsman gear preset. So what I end up doing with the primary weapons is I want to select something that has cutting damage. So all of that is going to include our axes. I do like to prioritize them 1 to 5, and I keep them sorted based off of their cutting damage that they do and based off the skill of strength. So as they require more strength to use the weapons, they're going to do higher damage. So for here, this is required a strength skill level of 6. And it does 67 cutting damage. So I have that as my number 1. I then move on to our second priority, which is going to be a strength skill requirement of 5. And then we have 4, 3, 2. And then at that point, they'll just equip any one-handed weapon that's available. Moving on to secondary, I have these equipped just as the highest hit points and sorting down just like we did with our primary weapons. And then we do the same for armors. So what I will do in this next section, I'm going to show you each one of my gear presets and what armors I use in what priority level up on the screen. I'll take a minute to pause in between each section, so head slot, torso, hands, legs, etc. As I'm going through these, I'm not going to do much talking. I'm just going to put it up on the screen so you guys can pause and use this right alongside of your own gameplay, and you can mirror exactly what I have set up. Before we wrap up, I want to cover a few common mistakes I see once players start using the staging ground more seriously. One of the biggest mistakes is never checking whether a villager is still worth keeping in your army. Just because someone worked well early on doesn't mean that they're still one of your best fighters. As you unlock better gear and recruit new villagers, it's completely normal for some early recruits to fall behind. At that point, they may be better off staying in your settlement as workers. That's not a failure, that's how the game progresses. Another common mistake is holding on to villagers with strong negative traits as your army grows. A good example of this is Coward. Early in the game, you'll often recruit villagers like this because your options are limited, and that's totally fine. But later on, these traits start to hold your army back. The exception is if a villager has extremely strong combat stats or high skill caps that generally outweigh the downside. Otherwise, these are usually the villagers you should be replacing first. The last mistake I get questions on are players trying to equip other items into the bow equipment slot. If a villager is a ranged fighter, they can only equip a bow and a one-handed weapon. That's because the bow uses the same equipment slot as a shield and two-handed weapon. This isn't a bug, this is just how the equipment system works. If you're running into issues with specific villagers or presets, let me know in the comments. I'm curious what setups people are struggling with or what's really working well for you. That's how I approach advanced staging ground setups, focusing on villager traits, long-term skill potential, and making sure gear choices actually support the role each villager is meant to play. It's about making intentional decisions so your army scales naturally as the game progresses, instead of fighting against your villager's own traits. If you haven't already, I do recommend checking out my earlier staging ground guide where I break down the basics. This video is meant to build directly on top of that foundation. I thank all of you guys for watching. If this helped, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to join the Gambit crew, and I will see you all in the next one.